Good morning. My name is André, and I'm from ILGA, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association. Welcome to this side event on laws that protect LGBT persons, changes, and challenges. We're going to be talking about the now annual ILGA report. There are copies around, and there will be people kind of just distributing these in the room. If you haven't got one at any point, then just raise your hand and we'll make sure that you get a copy. This is the 11th edition of this report, which goes through and talks about laws that criminalize, protect, and recognize LGBT persons in particular around the world. This is one of 3 side events at this council which are looking at LGBTI sexual orientation, gender identity issues. There was one earlier this week which looked at detention of LGBT persons, particularly in migration contexts. And today we're going to be looking, as you can see, on some of the laws that discriminate, but some of the changes that we've seen there. And next week, on Tuesday, there's going to be a 3rd side event, which is really going to be focusing on some of the violence that can be seen against LGBT persons. And I think at that moment, we just wanted to acknowledge the events that happened in Orlando, Florida on Sunday. Obviously, that's one example of horrific violence that took place for a number of very complicated reasons. We're still learning what was happening. But certainly it seems that LGBTI persons were targeted in that attack. Like I said, the event next week will be focusing much more on violence, so we won't be dwelling on that today, but we felt we couldn't go further without at least acknowledging. And I suppose to understand Orlando with the complexity of the arrangements, I think some of the themes that we'll have today is that although we're focusing on sexual orientation and gender identity, we can't ignore other issues. And issues of discrimination that face us are deeply interlinked with discrimination that are faced by other groups, whether that's on grounds of race or age. We stand in solidarity, of course, with all sorts of human rights movements, with the entire human rights movement in all its different manifestations. I guess just to kind of, as I finish this introduction here, is just to say that straight after this side event is going to be the first informal negotiation on the sexual orientation and gender identity resolution that's being brought to this council. That starts at 12 o'clock in room 21, and so we will be finishing this side event a few minutes before that to make sure that people can get to that room for that negotiation. Related to that, there are many, many civil society organizations around the world which are supporting this call for the resolution, for what it's calling for, which is the establishment of an independent expert. And again, this will be discussed more next week in particular, but we do want to highlight that there is a joint statement at the back of this room, which has been signed by more than 400 NGOs from over 100 countries around the world. So if you're interested to read that, do please pick up that statement. So, a long introduction from myself, but I wanted to welcome you here and immediately now turn to actually discussing this report. And the very first person I'm going to ask to do that is Angus, who is actually the author of this report. So, Angus, with no further ado, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, André. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. So just over these few minutes, I'm going to speak about, I'm going to outline some of the new features of this 11th edition of state-sponsored homophobia, that are designed to make it a little bit more alive and relevant to on-the-ground situations. I'll also present some of the headline figures under 3 categories of criminalization, protection, and recognition from this past year. And these are the broad categories under which sexual orientation laws can be organized. There are many different ways to look at how to organize and categorize law, but this is one we're using. I then want to briefly just look at the role specifically within the protection agenda of national human rights institutions as a positive and legitimizing force that helps our issues to trickle upwards from our grassroots into officialdom at national levels, and thereby make the link to the proposed special procedure or independent expert that is being spoken about here at the Council, who will be able to, if it happens, support that protective work with the sanction of international law. I'll come back to that towards the end. I'd like to make a note that this is important to note that this publication looks at sexual orientation-related law only. It does not explore the plethora of law that is specific to gender identity or to sex characteristics, intersex, around identity recognition, vast numbers of health issues, bodily integrity of intersex people, and many other issues. But having said that, sexual orientation law is as relevant to trans people and to intersex persons as it is to cisgender, gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. The sexual orientation piece is. This year, we made our usual overview, red to green map of the world. The maps are reproduced at the back of the publication. But we also made 3 further maps that look a little bit deeper into what compromises. Firstly, criminalization. You know, we looked at what crime precisely is criminalized. What is the term of law? Who is targeted, men or men and women within states? And has the law been operational in the past 3 years? Do we have evidence of arrests? The second map we look at is the blue one, which is protection, which breaks into 6 areas. The inclusion, first of all, the inclusion of sexual orientation within the mandate of a national human rights institution. And we mark that. Are they looking at sexual orientation? We're looking at employment, constitutional inclusion of sexual orientation, other provisions such as goods and services, health, education, etc., and hate crime incitement to hatred. And then in the recognition map, we look at marriage, civil partnership, joint adoption, and second parent adoption. At the back of state-sponsored homophobia, you will find charts, overview charts of the state of law across regions. So we have essays by experts and advocates, legal experts and advocates in the 5 continents, and we have a charted at the front of all of those essays. They're quite extensive and quite detailed and need to be studied. Also, just to let you know that the spreadsheet or Excel file with all of this data will be, for the first time, made available at ILGA. So, one observation often made about a compendium of law like state-sponsored homophobia is that it's really only looking at part of the problem. Law is, you know, doesn't solve everything. And addressing law will not solve the systemic erasure and invisibilizing of our realities and identities in the public space. At ILGA, we very much concur with this view, but we also recognize that there's real value in having this kind of compendium. We tried to, this year, as I said, we're trying to bring a little bit more life to the dry text of laws. And so we're looking at national human rights institutions, equality authorities, human rights commissions, ombudsman's offices, public defenders, as constituted under the Paris Principles, and whether or not they include sexual orientation in their mandates. I mean, their influence in societies and states can be sizable. So we've symbolized that. We see that there are 88 states in the world that we know look at sexual orientation in their work. And then we have another 10 or 11 that we're not sure they've engaged with events around the world, but there isn't any documentation around sexual orientation yet. We've indicated the active deployment of the law to, you know, as it's used to intimidate and suppress sexual minorities and gender minorities, obviously, thus acknowledging the chill factor that the very existence of law provokes. We record if the law applies to men only or to both male and female identified individuals. We're all acutely aware how often arrests are made by police in order to extract bribes and coerce sex from vulnerable individuals and do not necessarily lead to prosecutions. We use a symbol here of handcuffs with a tick, an X, or a question mark. And we note that of the current 73 criminalizing states in the world, 49 of them we can find evidence of such arrests over the past 3 years. In the criminalizing states, we have charted what a given law actually penalizes, the precise language. Is it acts against nature? Is it buggery? Is it sodomy? Is it promotion of non-traditional values? Or is it a morality crime, a crime against morality? And these will generally apply in a lot of the Islamic states and the Sharia states. And you can study the criminalization map here, which will show you some numbers and data, etc. A quick view. On the issue of bringing more socio-legal context to the laws we're charting, the entries on criminalizing states, the 73, are much expanded and are drawing from reports and documentation on any given country, and specifically quoting relevant material from both the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review, and the treaty body work done in these chambers at the United Nations. So, fulfilling its role as a reference source, there are many hundreds of hyperlinks throughout this document, and these are all live on the PDFs. Finally, we included some public attitudes data from a global survey that ILGA ran this year, which I'm not going to speak about now, but that's explained in the document. So these are the 5 kind of new areas that we've explored in this document. There's lots of other areas that we haven't dealt with. As I've said, the whole trans and intersex area is just not part of the scope of this document. But also within the scope of this document, we haven't tracked, for example, asylum and refugee informations and the legislations around that. We haven't tracked issues, for example, around registration of NGOs in states and the problems that have come up around that. And indeed, the excellent outcomes in places like Botswana this year. These aren't tracked in this, so I'm calling that. Neither have we tracked actual prosecutions, and a lot to do with reproductive rights. We haven't moved into that territory yet. Maybe we will, maybe we won't in time. So I'm just now going to speak about some of the developments in the world over the past period. As regards actual legal developments between 2015 and now, as of this month, June 2016, there are 121 UN member states where there are no legal penalties levelled for consensual, private, same-sex sexual activity. And there are 73 states that we classify as criminalising states for the reasons I've already said. We note that in 45 of these 73 states, women are targeted, 24 in Africa, 13 in Asia, 6 in the Americas, and 2 in Oceania. And the other states are men only. Attesting to the impact of international human rights mechanisms like the UPR, we saw that both the Seychelles and Nauru recently, that mentioned in their first UPRs 5 years ago that they would look at decriminalising, actually just did so now in the period of their second UPR. So that does kind of attest to the power of that mechanism. Although, of course, these are individual parliaments making national decisions. Hopefully this won't take 5 years in all cases for the rest of 73. I'm not going to speak too much about this, but regarding the death penalty countries, we are listing 13 at the moment, but there are 5 of those where it's not implemented, and there is, of those, 2 or 3 are being contested about whether or not actually the Sharia codifies under zina, under the adultery. So there's a little bit of discussion that needs to happen there. But anyway, we have 8 states where it's very active, the death penalty for same-sex sexual activity. Researchers at Outright Action International provided us with information on 14 states where we have morality codes in the Middle East and North Africa. where the promotion or expression of same-sex trans realities are penalized. And with the rise of social media, this is really can get very terrifying. We also have in Russia, Lithuania, and Nigeria promotion laws, and where penalizations happens, and these are being discussed. They're in this advanced stage in Kyrgyzstan at the moment, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, Bulgaria, and Latvia. Interestingly, these are being mooted, these kinds of laws. More positively, Ukraine and Angola passed non-discrimination employment laws that include sexual orientation in their ambit in late 2015. Laws on discrimination in the workplace have substantial impact on those who are protected by them, allowing not only a basic independent income, but importantly the ability to flourish in one's working life and one's identity. We found that Vanuatu, Thailand and Indonesia actually have such laws on the books, but they haven't been litigated at this point as far as we know. In terms of protection and non-discrimination, there are a growing consciousness across states and dialogues in states in this area, in our area, and that's fantastic, but it really needs to be built upon. I think that the role of the NRHIs needs to be focused on. I think there's a huge amount of work that advocates can do in states with NRHIs and educating and pushing NRHIs to encompass sexual orientation within their mandates. And I think if this new independent expert position does transpire, I think the relationship between these institutions will really be interesting for SOGI advocates around the world. I think I'll leave it there. There's lots more I could say, but won't, because I don't have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. One of the things I love about this report is the fact that it says updated to June 2016. We released this in May. 1 month later, we had to update it because things are changing that rapidly. Of course, a lot needs to change. 49 countries where arrests are still happening. There's a lot of some very kind of sobering statistics there. But I think even as I look at the map that's behind us at the moment on that screen, is just a reminder that protection laws exist actually in a surprising number of countries around the world, more than you might initially guess. So it's clear that there's an incredible amount going on. We're going to turn to the other human rights defenders who are on the panel with us, and we're going to kind of just do a bit more back and forth questions. And we're going to start with Micah, who is the International Advocacy Advisor at RFSL, the Swedish Federation for LGBT. Thank you. And so, Micah, we've heard a lot about the state of laws around the world on protection in employment, on discriminatory laws, kind of focusing on same-sex activity. And I'm just wondering, from a kind of a trans perspective, is there a similar landscape for trans persons?
Thanks, André. Yes, I'm gonna add a bit of a spin to the maps that we saw, or what Angus was talking about from the trans perspective. There's a lot of obviously issues around trans, the rights of trans people, but I chose to focus only on one particular issue, which is legal gender recognition, because I think that issue impacts a lot of other things that are very important for daily lives of trans people. So I chose to show this map because usually when we think about Europe, we look at the Western Europe being very green, which would mean that the situation for LGBT persons is very good, and then we have the traditional eastern part of the map, which is usually very red. And the trans activists usually say that this is actually not true when it comes to trans legislation or protection of trans people. So I wanted to show you that map, that right now in Europe, 23 countries still require trans person to undergo forced sterilization when they want to change their legal gender on their documents. The map that some of you got and the one that is on the screen says 24, but the map was released in May and now things change to connect to what André was saying. So right now Norway also was added to the blue side and they changed their laws like 2 weeks ago, I think. And forced sterilization is one of the requirements, among others, that trans persons are asked to go under or through when they want to change the legal gender on their documents. And for other people who don't usually change the documents or identities, they don't think about it. So you have your ID document, it states your name, it states your gender, you travel, you open your bank account, you rent a movie, if you need your ID for that. Whereas for trans person, those things are not that obvious. Very often, the IDs don't match to the lived identities. And then when we want to change our documents, we face different requirements that we need to obliged in order to have the gender changed. So I will give you a few examples of the laws that are now in force in some countries, even though they are on the blue side. So for instance, as you can see, Poland is blue, which would mean that sterilization is not required. However, there is no proper framework in place, so that would tell you exactly what to do. So for instance, in order to change your name, you still have to take your parents to court and basically say that they gave you the wrong name at birth, and the court need to set this thing legally, which, as you can imagine, that sometimes it's very problematic. In general, it's very problematic. But if you don't, for instance, if you don't want to have contact with your parents, it adds to stress and complications. In Sweden, in the country that I live, for instance, the law changed, so we are not required to go through sterilization. However, other laws that kind of are related and gendered have not been updated. So for instance, there are issues with birth certificates of a child who is born to a trans person. So a trans man giving birth to a child has difficulties to be registered as a parent, not as a mother, which obviously doesn't make sense if the person is legally recognized as a male. There is a lot of work going around that, and this is changing, but still it's not put in the framework. I wanted to also make a point about Ukraine, which is red on the map, so you know that there is not very many good things are happening. But additionally to the forced sterilization, a trans person has to face up to 45 days in a psychiatric institution as a part of the process. And I usually have a difficulty explaining why those requirements are put in place, because I get a lot of questions about that, and I don't really have good answers to it, apart from pathologizing trans identities and policing our bodies. But I wanted to finish on the positive note. This map, when I started to work on forced sterilization, this map was very red. It was just a few years ago. And each year we see more and more countries getting blue. And more countries decide to get rid of all requirements. And now 4 countries in Europe base their laws on so-called self-determination. So you just basically are supposed to go to the authority responsible for changes, making changes in your legal documents, and say, I would like to identify as this, and they are supposed to process the request without any medical intervention, any diagnosis, and so on. So those heroes in Europe, as I call them, is Malta, Ireland, Denmark, and Norway from 2 weeks ago. So I hope next time we meet, the map will look much better. I will stop for now.
Thank you. Just right at the outset, this might be a 287-page report, but I think we're already beginning to see how much can't even begin to be addressed in something like this. And thank you for opening up a whole other area where there's so much needed to be changed. We're going to turn to Jacobus. Jacobus from Namibia, but works with Pan-Africa ILGA in Johannesburg and is the programs director for Pan-Africa ILGA. Jacobus, we've been, in Angus's presentation, we talked a lot about laws on criminalization, protection and recognition. But Angus also kind of hinted, and we've heard a little bit from Micah as well, that there are many other laws and other areas that actually really matter to human rights defenders on the ground. And I was wondering if you could share, what are the things that really matter to LGBTI advocates in the African continent, if you can speak as broadly as that, or at least to the context which you feel you can.
Well, is it on? Thanks, André. And I could, of course, speak forever on that topic. But I think I should just start off by sort of saying job well done to ILGA and to Angus for once again bringing us this report. I mean, it's amazing to see that there is some change happening globally, especially also from the region that I'm coming from, which is Africa. But it's also very important that we have reports like this that keep highlighting the difficult areas and the difficult regions and countries with regards to criminalization around LGBTI issues. And so in relation to your question, I agree that very often our conversations, and especially at spaces like these, around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex rights and advocacy around that is focused on criminalization. And very often we forget that there are communities, civil society organizations, representatives that work in these regions who might not necessarily be at the stage where they are talking about decrim, but that there are a myriad of other complexities that they are facing with as an immediate. And so coming from Africa, I think I'd like to speak to a lot, but and I'll try and touch on as many of those that I can. Angus spoke about this very briefly. One of our biggest challenges is being recognized as legal entities, as civil society organizations, as registered actors to undertake the advocacy work that we need to do on our continent. And so when I speak, I'm going to speak about a lot of issues, but I think we must remember that they're all linked to decrim. Is that the situation for African civil society has been made difficult and almost impossible to do the important work that we need to do. Pan-African ILGA is a federation, membership federation of 110 organizations on the African continent doing LGBTI advocacy work. Of those 110 organizations, only 33 have legal registration status on the continent. And so again, working and living on an African continent where almost 36 African countries still criminalize homosexuality, the act of homosexuality, however it is sort of defined in all of the African states, it is almost difficult to impossible to do our work. Where organizations such as SEDEP in Malawi, organizations such as WARE in Nigeria, organizations such as GALS in Zimbabwe, are often berated by police that burst into the offices claiming information, taking computers, taking files, because you are not allowed to do this type of work. You are not registered, you are not recognized. Where organizations in Uganda, again in Malawi, organizations in Swaziland face break-ins day in and day out, and their information is being stolen and sort of destroyed, creating spaces where they are not able to continue with the work that they're supposed to do. It's impossible. It makes work difficult and it makes life hard. On a continent where the smaller organizations, the grassroots organizations, the community-based organizations that do the most important work, that do the direct outreach to LGBTI communities on the ground, often cannot do this work without resources. It becomes difficult for donors and funders to come in and fund you without a registration certificate. I mean, we've had these conversations with a lot of development partners, and to some extent, it's starting to become a little bit more easier to convince them that a $50,000 grant, which will not be able to or help a regional organization to do a lot of work, can help a grassroots organization do important, very important, beautiful work. That conversation is only now starting to seem like it's bearing some fruits. And so that also creates a lot of limitations around the registration issue. Of course, in general, the situation limits the amount of work that we're able to do. And as Pan-African ILGA, together with together with ILGA and some of the other regional organizations, we're trying to see how we can speak to mechanisms such as the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly and Association to take up this cause on the African continent. Another sort of critical and most important point right now, André, is that we're realizing on the African continent a lot of our human rights defenders, defenders of LGBT human rights, are finding themselves in situations where they have to leave the continent and do their work from outside. This one is sort of brought on by the lack of or an absence of a protection for human rights defenders, and more specifically the defenders of LGBTI rights on the continent. We find that the communities that are left behind are often communities that are not regarded as or seen as human rights defenders, and so beautiful programs like the EU-funded program, which is there to support defenders of human rights, often overlook and leave behind a critical group, an important group, which are supposed to be the beneficiaries of these types of programs. We find that our communities that we leave behind when we are working in Brussels and Sweden and Geneva, trying to advocate very strongly for our work, feel left behind, they feel abandoned. And so very often there's little that we can do. Very often when we are banned from leaving our countries and when we have the opportunity to, there is very little opportunity to then return. And so I think one of the critical and most important issues at this council, and also when we're talking about the protection of human rights defenders, is that we need to look at this more critically and more importantly. Another critical aspect is the access to information, and linking this to the access to health, which is of course an important discussion that has been taking place for a long time on the continent. We know that in the absence of protective laws or situations of decrim on the African continent, speaking about LGBTI issues have only been made possible by speaking to the access to health. And so for the past 10 years, we have been using HIV programming on the continent to bring in issues around lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex individuals. We have good examples in Namibia, where I'm from, where the government has gone as far as recognizing these communities when we're speaking about HIV as key communities and as most at-risk communities, have committed to addressing the health disparities, issues around access to health, and sort of including these communities in the national response to HIV by writing them into the national strategic framework, recognizing that they are key and that they should be addressed, going as far as partnering with the CDC and other civil society in Namibia, conducting an integrated biological behavioral surveillance study, which basically says the Namibian government has moved from saying MSM don't exist, LGBTI people don't exist, to say, okay, we accept that you exist, we know that you're saying we exist, can we now have the study that will say what are the number of men who have sex with men in Namibia, what are the number of trans individuals that identify as sex workers in Namibia, and how can we then address their needs? But going as far as that and then turning around to a very deplorable state as a government and then refusing to release this data, that limits our access to information as civil society to undertake the important work we need to do around HIV for our communities, around access to health. And so playing those double standards also as states, creating a phase for the high-level meetings at the UN around we are integrating these communities, we do recognize them, and then still sort of keeping hostage of information that we are supposed to work with, I think are also issues that we need to address. And so what I'm trying to say, André, really is that while we're talking about criminalization, and it's important that we talk about criminalization, is that in these spaces we also think about all of these other myriads of complexities we face on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacobus. And I think we're hearing loud and clear that these are complex issues. These are intersecting in many different ways, and actually sometimes the issues that actually matter on the ground are very different from what we might initially think. I'm also really happy to hear about some of those kind of positive changes, changes that you've seen in the Namibian in health. Of course, with the recent granting of the right for Lega Bibo to register as an NGO in Botswana, we're also seeing just some great steps forward taking place. We're gonna jump in a plane and fly from Africa right over to the Philippines now. Kaye, you're at the Pilipina Legal Resources Center, which is one of the NGOs that contributed to the anti-discrimination ordinance, which included SOGI, I believe, in the in that recent law that was passed in the Philippines. And I think just to continue this theme of like intersecting with just such deep parts of who we are as people, I was wondering, could you, Kaye, talk a little bit to experiences from the Philippines, how the Philippine society has changed, and how issues continue to kind of just intersect in so many different ways? Thank you.
Thank you, André. Much of our world divides the right against discrimination and violence and hunger and the right to pleasure. There is this artificial separation of needs between poor women and rich women in the Philippines, between first world and third world. Namely that the first world needs freedom for sexual pleasure, and the third world, like the Philippines, needs freedom from hunger, freedom from poverty, freedom from violence and discrimination. So I think feminist politics must be linked to all aspects of the world, and women's position in the global economy must relink ethics to materiality of our bodies to the world, because sexuality is related to development, and sexuality can bring either happiness or hopelessness, and bring misery, life and death. And for example, as an acknowledgement that indeed many people around the world are killed every year because of their sexual orientation, it's very much happening in the Philippines. Well, the good news is 2010, that the outcome of the United Nations voted to protect LGBTs and LGBTs from extrajudicial executions, and has finalized in the direction to restore reference to sexual orientation. But right now, we have a pending bill in the Congress, and the incoming president has expressed his support for the passage of that bill. The anti-discrimination bill is with reference to sexual orientation and gender identity, which is good news for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Kaye. And I'm going to kind of just jump into a question, because we're sitting here in the Human Rights Council, part of the United Nations system, and we've heard reference already from several of you on how the UN has perhaps influenced your work on the ground. Certainly Angus mentioned the UPR, Jacobus was mentioning high-level meetings, so we had one just last week on HIV and AIDS, for example, in New York. So I'm kind of going to ask the three panelists in the center here, if you could speak a little bit to how useful has the UN been? How can it be particularly useful for you in your work and for human rights defenders on the ground? And we're going to jump right back to Micah to start us off on that one.
Thank you, André. I would say, going back to the issue that I was bringing up, I think UN, different UN mechanisms were quite instrumental when it comes to bringing attention to, for instance, forced sterilization and how abusive this requirement is. So, for instance, one of the examples that I would bring here is the thematic report of the Special Rapporteur on Torture, which was released in 2013, and it was looking at torture in healthcare settings. And it was the first time actually that the UN body mechanism said that forced sterilization of trans people is such a big violation that it actually falls under torture mandate. So that was quite important piece of recognition for us working on the ground. Another example is, for instance, Human Rights Committee addressed specifically the situation in Ukraine in 2013, addressing the fact that trans people are supposed to be in the psychiatric institution up to 45 days, and saying that Ukraine is supposed to change the laws, basically. And they gave specific points, like how it should be changed. CEDAW committee as well addressed forced sterilization. So there are different examples of how UN can elevate the issue, and actually we were talking in our group in the training that UN is a megaphone and gives the voice, or it can give voice to groups who are not necessarily being heard in their countries. So even actually having a discussion that forced sterilization is an outrageous requirement is a step to changes. And it comes from the European context, where the Human Rights Commissioner said that trans people are the only group in Europe, since it was European context, who are legally required to be sterilized. Roma people, sterilization of Roma people is illegal. Sterilization of people with disabilities is illegal. Trans people is the only group who actually are legally going through this abuse. So I would say that UN has been and is quite instrumental for trans persons' rights.
Thank you, Micah. And I think I'll just pass the question coming back again down the row. Like, Jacobus, how do you think the UN can be useful?
I think one of the best mechanisms that we've gotten from the UN, especially on the African continent, is the UPR mechanism. And we have over the years started to work very strongly on that mechanism, really highlighting the fact that it is a tool that allows civil society and also as a citizen gives you the platform and the opportunity to really keep your government to task or hold them to task and call them out on human rights violations in those countries. And so we've really worked a lot on that mechanism. I think the UN has been helpful, André, very specifically. We can look at the past to the 2011 and the 2014 resolutions that were passed by the Human Rights Council on sexual orientation and gender identity, and sort of mandating situational reports, annual reports on the situation of LGBTI issues across the continent, and those reports really strongly bringing out strong cases of violations of rights of sexual minorities and communities around SOGI issues around the world, not only in Africa, in the Asia Pacific, in Europe, and really highlighting those. And I think what is happening at the UN this time around is really and can strongly be attributed to that, but also the strong work of civil society in the resilience and the perseverance, but coupling that with the strong mechanisms we have available here. And so I think it's been an important space, it's been important mechanisms, and the past few weeks, learning that there are a lot of other mechanisms outside of the UPR and treaty bodies, and that we can use all of these sort of in a puzzle that fit into each other to get the best out of it. I think that has been a great eye-opener. And I would urge activists, civil society, human rights defenders from around the world to explore initiatives around working at this space, but also those of us that know about it, and I think even the UN as an institution, to make this more visible and accessible at the same time.
Thank you, Jacobus, and I think Jacobus alluded to that the three human rights defenders right here are actually here on a training course for 2 weeks, learning exactly just the myriad of ways to engage with the human rights system, including the with the UN system, including the human rights system we have here. So again, there we go, Kaye, you yourself, how can the UN be useful for your work?
Actually, it has already been very useful. In place of our national law, we have a local ordinance already on anti-discrimination with reference to SOGI, and one of its authority and basis are the UN treaty laws, namely the 1981 Declaration of Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on religion and belief. So that's how it has been useful. We have utilized that.
Yep, so I'm going to back to Micah, and then we're going to go to Angus as well.
I wanted to just add a little bit of, I don't know, maybe play devil's advocate. Because very often when we look at those spaces, I try to think about who is actually left from our work and who is left behind from all those mechanisms that we look at. And very often when we talk about gender identity or trans, I think what people hear is the binary, right? So one person changes identity or legal documents from one box to another, as I say. And then I go to people who actually don't identify with either or. And I think for me, this is the gap that we as a community and activists should pay a bit more attention to. And there are, I think, 2 examples coming from the UN. I think it was the latest report, again, from the Special Rapporteur on Torture, looking at detention. And then he specifically talks about gender non-conforming people, which was quite an extraordinary thing to read for me, because usually we don't focus on those specific identities, and I would really like more of that.
Oh, I just wanted to say that the work that Helen Nolan and Diana are doing in ILGA, for example, amongst other organizations, shows just the vast and compiles the vast amount of activity around SOGI that is actually going on. Just, I mean, beyond the other mechanisms that are there, but in the UPR and the treaty bodies. And one of the reasons that state-sponsored homophobia is so weighty this year is because it charts an awful lot of that really relevant material. You know, the obligations, particularly around the treaties, the legal obligations on signatories to the treaty body, the terms of the treaty bodies, are really huge. They are beyond, they go beyond the scope of national law in many ways. And national law must answer to the obligations and the agreements that are made in the international space. And as such, these bodies give that interpretive space and create the discussion exactly as Micah was speaking about. And so I just think it's certainly from my observation as a viewer of these things and a compiler, I am blown away by the quantity of material that is showing up in these forums.
Thank you. And I think we've heard incredible amounts in the ways that the UN impacts, whether it's through the UPR. We've heard about treaty bodies. But for me, it's about engagement with governments. It's often about visibility. It's about having conversations about issues that haven't often been raised before. And thanks, Micah, again, for raising a gender binary discussion, which needs to take place here, as well as amongst civil society. And also Angus for highlighting the iteration and development of international human rights law that takes place here and how that applies to people, LGBTI and others around the world. It was great to hear about Kaye saying, well, actually, it's already been useful. Like the UN documents are incredibly powerful. We've heard of them being referenced in national legislation. They're also mentioned in court cases we've heard before. And I did like what Micah said there about the UN as a megaphone. And I think it is. It's often a space where those groups who are often most marginalized don't get a chance to speak back home. But this is actually a place which allows access to civil society organizations to be able to talk in a respectful space. We've had questions, you've been answering a lot of questions here, and I'm sure there are many questions from the floor, and I can see one or two hands going up already. So we're going to take those questions, so I'm going to put my earpiece on to listen. So I can see Michael van Gelderen at the back there.
Thank you, André, and congratulations to ILGA and for the publication of the state-sponsored homophobia report, which is an incredible resource for all persons at the UN, among society, for states as well, working on issues of human rights violations against lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons. And congratulations also to the panelists for their work. There's been really important developments in the last 10 to 15 years at the UN in recognizing human rights violations against LGBT and intersex people and in issuing recommendations and clarifying the application of human rights law to these violations. But at the same time, there are still gaps, and some of the panelists have pointed to those. And the High Commissioner flagged this in his report to the Human Rights Council last year. There are still gaps in the international protection system. And that is why it is very much of interest that a group of states are proposing an initiative at this Human Rights Council to address this gap. The UN is very much committed at the very highest level, from the Secretary General to all the principals and heads of UN agencies, to doing more to address violence and discrimination against LGBT and intersex people. Across all aspects, whether it's violence and torture and ill treatment in detention or in medical settings, and we've heard the issue of ill treatment in medical settings, or addressing discriminatory laws, or fighting discrimination in education, in health, in housing, in employment. And to work with states and civil societies and national human rights institutions to do this, and not just in Geneva or in the headquarters, but also at the country level, in engaging with governments, with parliaments, with national institutions and stakeholders to propose changes in practical and concrete ways to make a difference to the lives of people. I've brought some materials here highlighting some of the work that the UN is doing, but I'd be happy to engage with anyone if anyone has any questions about the UN's work on this.
Thank you, Michael. And I see a couple more questions here. So we'll take a few questions now before any responses. So Cynthia.
So I also want to offer appreciation and thanks. And one of the things that you've all, I think, done an extraordinary job of is, you know, you offer your information with nuance, and I appreciate that, because there is a level of detail that sometimes comes across as so monolithic, and it's not within our communities. Our communities experience violations and discrimination differently, to some extent, and sometimes in similar ways. But I actually want to ask you, and I don't direct this question necessarily to any of you explicitly, but for anyone who'd like to answer, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you're seeing lesbian experience in particular in relation to law, activism, violations. I know that under the umbrella of LGBT and intersex advocacy and human rights concerns, there is a tendency to meld these communities under that acronym and that umbrella. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about either your findings in relation to the report or in the advocacy that that you're all doing on a day-to-day level. Thanks.
Thank you. There was the gentleman back there, and then Arvind. Yourself, yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Fabio Agostoni from Associazione Comunità Papa Giovanni 2023, is tongue twister, sorry, is APG 23. We are an association that's sharing life directly with the poorest, and as you know, there is a lot of form of marginalization and poorest. My question is in connection with a kind of new phenomenon that is the commercial maternal surrogacy. We see that there is a movement from civil society and from state that is going to try to criminalize this practice connected with the commercial side of maternal surrogacy. And I would ask your opinion or your thought about this.
Thank you, and then Arvind.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, the presentations and the excellent report. Just to make the point that I think it will be a very, very useful tool for advocacy, this particular report, and to just give you one small instance of how it's worked so far. In the Indian Supreme Court, when the arguments were being put forward, the ILGA maps were a very, very useful tool, you know, just to make the point of, you know, which side do you want to see your country on, as it were. So, and the non-discrimination maps are a very useful addition as well. And I think just the visual point which you're making, that actually non-discrimination laws are there in many parts of the world, is a very, very useful addition to our current work. Thank you so much.
And we have a question right here at the front.
Thank you so much. Yeah, is it on? Waleska Pareja from Ecuador. I'm a lawyer and I work with several people from the LGBTQI community. My question regards to the actual compliance with the Constitution and the international norms. Because it's very difficult in a country like Ecuador that if you can hear several official declarations, we have an amazing constitution that is very inclusive, that we have specific provisions in regarding to sexual diversity and identity, but then the reality is different. Constitutions are not enough, legal instruments are not enough, because you can actually observe that in Ecuador we have several rehabilitation clinics that are supposed to be for drug addictions, and there's people from the sexual diversities that are incarcerated there, actually, and this is something that has been going on for decades, but only like for several years that it's in the public sphere, but they are not closed yet. Also, there's been a campaign to have the gender and not the sex in our ID, in our cédula de identidad, but it's not going to have a great end. And now we have like a government or official authorities that said like this is the best government for LGBTQI people, but it's not. Having only a constitution is not enough because the reality is different, and the everyday discrimination that my friends are suffering, I cannot even tell you about it. I was a lawyer for the only and the last lesbian woman that has a pension when her partner died. But it was like a political thing. It was very nice for the picture. But now every time we want to have another person to have the pension, they say like, oh, no, that was a different time. It was 2-3 years ago. We don't have the procedures. It was something because that other director was here. But we don't want to do it anymore. So thank you if you can give me some guidance how to help the community. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the panelists here. We haven't allocated the questions amongst, so I'll suggest that those who wish to kind of tackle any of those particular questions go ahead, and I'll try and conclude at the end there.
Oh, you're not making our morning easy with those questions. Maybe I will try with Cynthia's question. I think the challenge of seeing actual people behind the acronym is the challenge in general in our work, because we so often put exactly the acronym. So, for instance, I know that the T is lost very often, the B pretty much doesn't exist. Lesbians, we don't focus specifically on lesbian issues either. So I think for me, what I've been trying to do, or at least encourage, is to have the voices behind the letters present in those conversations. So the narrative or the issues are not the same. So we don't have only the gay men who usually run the movement, and this is the historical structure of our movement. And I mean, it's not always easy or comfortable to say, but we should challenge it every time that we can, and we can possibly change that. So at least that's my undercover mission, to have as many different voices and the identities behind the acronym present in the room. It's not always the easiest thing to do for different reasons, but I don't know if that answers somehow the question that you have. I will give others.
To Cynthia's question, not only do I identify as a lesbian, I also identify as a feminist, because I was raised by a feminist who is also engaged in the international law arena. So I feel like the feminist movement has always been a friend to the LGBT movement. And I feel like we have the same sense of solidarity in issues like bodily autonomy, sexuality, and even reproductive health. So let's work together.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think I'll say much on Cynthia's one. Is it on?
It's blinking.
Oh, okay. So, because the colleagues have already alluded to that, I think legally for lesbians, without being a lawyer, I would say, and maybe speaking to the Namibian experience, is that in our laws, the criminalization is actually on the act, and it criminalizes same-sex sexual activity between two men, which basically leaves lesbians and other women who have sex with women in a law-abiding framework, if we're talking about legality. But of course, it links to the question around societal behaviors and understandings of these types of things. And so when we say homosexuality is illegal in Namibia, it is a broad understanding by society that it is actually illegal. It is illegal for gay, bisexual, lesbian, intersex, whatever. The understanding is that or the understanding is not that it is only sodomy, the actual act between two men. In fact, it is only sodomy, the act of sodomy. So if you want to go further, you can say anal sex between a heterosexual couple.
Absolutely.
Is also illegal. And so those are conversations that we need to start to have around societal understanding and interpretation of these laws that we have around. In terms of activism, I'm starting to see in Namibia, but also around the continent, that there is this growing both feminist but also LGBT women's claim for space, leadership, an opportunity to talk about their issues and to be the right representatives around these discussions. I think at the Pan-African ILGA conference there was a really strong call for trans women, there was a really strong call from lesbian women and bisexual women to be afforded and accorded their own space to talk outside, because as much as we are a unified community, our issues are also very different to each other, and only when we meet and can convene and sort of claim this leadership amongst ourselves, so that is really happening. I think generally you can see a lot of leadership from LGBT women on the African continent, and stronger activists coming on in that forefront. I think in terms of violence, again linking it with this question, and also what Kaye said around the intersectionality, women are women, and women often do and will face multiple forms of discrimination based just on that. There are issues around SRH needs for LGBT women. There are issues around the work that I do specifically around HIV for LGBT women, and only recognizing men who have sex with men and trans women as a key population, and sort of leaving out this other group that is also having sex and that could be at risk, and perpetrating this myth that their sex is safe and healthy. Of course, making situations a lot more difficult for them. In terms of, and so around the Constitution, I think it's something that we can see all over. I think South Africa is one of the countries, and it's where I live, it's one of the countries with the most beautiful constitutions in the world. At the same time, South Africa is one of the places where you can see the most horrific stories around violence and discrimination against LGBTI people, where you have lesbian women who continually undergo cases of corrective rape because there's this understanding that if I sleep with you and I, sorry for my French, fuck you right, you will become straight. And so those societal understandings, community understandings, doesn't really help having a good constitution. And I think maybe, and I'm leaning more towards it, that our activism should now be double-fold, that we should continue with our high end, working with policy makers, working with the UN, working with decision makers to make the legal environment livable for LGBT communities, but that we also work very, very, very closely with those that have an influence on the perceptions and opinions of communities. These are our religious leaders, our community leaders, our political leaders. We found just last week that the former president of Nigeria, who signed the anti-gay bill some time back, actually after stepping down as president, came and said, you know what, I think I did a wrong thing. And so also when we engage with politicians in our settings, one-to-one, they will very often tell you, no, it's not my personal opinion, it's not what I think, but because of my job and because of what my bosses say and because of what the understanding is, this is what I need to say. And I think we need to have those conversations, that it is really the responsibility of these leaders, religious, political, community, to start making statements around human rights that are true and fair statements, that only when they speak clearly and speak up about these issues that the communities that follow them will start to understand and maybe take different perspective on this. And so the responsibility lies on them, but also lies with us to work in that area with the community, I think.
Angus?
So, yeah, no, absolutely what you're saying is huge, Jacobus, I think. Yes, absolutely. Just very briefly, I mean, Cynthia, you mentioned the kind of the monolithic, history, and I think law really is one of the spaces that the monolith, and so the application to people, male identified, female identified, I think is a a monolithic practice that we are up against. I think, I mean, around your surrogacy question and there are instruments that states bring to bear to maintain what they would see as traditional values of their cultures or their countries. So when they have attacks, in inverted commas, like trans bathroom bills, surrogacy issues, this whole area, you have got states then creating new law to create impediments in those directions. I can't really speak too much about what I don't know too much about your area. As regards what you mentioned about Ecuador, a constitution is a supreme source of law of a state. It is its supreme source of law, is the Constitution. So when we have mentions of sexual orientation protection or gender identity protections within a Constitution, we at least have somewhere to appeal to. However, practice on the ground, as you described and as everybody here has described, is appallingly lax in that direction. So you do have got to take challenges to horrible practice. I don't think constitutions in themselves provide adequate protection. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 6 minutes until the first informal starts on the next SOGI resolution. I just wanted to say thank you to all the panelists. Like I said at the beginning, this document is 187 pages long. I think we've just had a hint today of how much longer it could be, how much else there is out there. We want to thank you for coming along and listening, and I want to thank the panelists for speaking today. Thank you.
Thank you, André.